Well, good evening and welcome to another Workers' Party X Space Call the Doctor with Dr. Bob Gill. We've got quite a bit to talk about this evening, Bob, and obviously we would welcome any contributions from our listeners. But I know we spoke about the junior doctors or the resident doctors strike last week, but I mean, it's still very current, isn't it? And we've heard the Prime Minister now saying it's beyond belief or something that the doctors could consider going on strike, coming on top of Wes Streeting's outburst last year when I think he accused them of being juvenile delinquents or something. But just give us an update, will you, Bob, on what the latest is in regards to the doctors' strike going forward.
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, the strike is still on, due to start middle of next week. You're right, Wes Streeting's making lots of accusations and making patronising comments to the doctors in terms of laying on the pressure. Why they're doing it this time of year? We're combating a super flu. But it's all a bit of a pretext to use it as a doctor bashing opportunity. In terms of the super flu, we touched on that last week. And, the Department of Health's own figures show that actually this season is not that much different to every year. And they seem to be really exaggerating the threat to pile on the pressure, and just for political purposes, it seems to me.
Yeah. What do you make of Keir Starmer's, I've got to say, Sir Keir Starmer's comment that he said it's frankly, just to quote him, frankly beyond belief that the resident doctors would strike during the NHS's worst moment since the pandemic. And he says that the NHS and patients who need it would be in grave danger. I mean, what do you make of that remark?
Well, I'd say, frankly, it's beyond belief that this government hasn't managed to resolve the issue with restoring doctors' pay, particularly as we've got a recruitment and morale crisis. So the person with all the power to resolve this problem is just pointing the finger elsewhere, which is typical of Starmer. I think he's got to be one of the most deeply unpopular prime ministers in this country's history. And I'm quite confident to say anything that comes out of his mouth won't really land with much power, because he's totally discredited.
Yeah. What do you make of the BMA's comment, the British Medical Association? I mean, they're saying that I guess you would agree with this, but they're saying that the government should not be scaremongering and making the public think that to quote them again, the NHS will not be able to look after them and their loved ones. Is that a fair comment?
Absolutely. Politicians like to scaremonger to achieve an objective. But as I've said, they're exaggerating the consequences of the flu, the seasonal flu. And, there've been multiple strikes now, and they'll just have to follow the procedure where emergency care has to be conducted safely and other care postponed. But let's not forget, the majority of people languishing on waiting lists and, requiring treatment they're not getting is down to consecutive governments cutting capacity and problems with workforce capacity as well, not down to the strikes. The strikes overall have quite a small impact on the waiting list for routine and elective surgery and treatment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jack Fletcher, the chair of the BMA, said that he would meet Streeting at any time to try to agree a deal to avert the strikes, and said it was cruel and calculated for the health secretary to fail to have any engagement with outside the strikes, and then come to the BMA with an offer that he knows is poor and expects them to just accept it within 24 hours. I mean, it is a bit of kind of moral blackmail, isn't it, that the health secretary is trying on against the resident doctors?
Yeah, I think these tactics just demonstrate bad faith. We have a Starmer government which is continuing on the legacy of previous administrations, and ultimately they are not concerned with patient care, patient safety, and the quality of service provision. So, to say that they're worried about the impact of the strikes is disingenuous, because the rest of their policy flow damages patient care. This is totally inconsistent.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we've spoken about in previous episodes, isn't it, Bob? That the government are definitely speaking with forked tongue in relation, to this dispute, and I think one of your frustrations is that the BMA should be really speaking out about some of the reforms that the government is bringing in, which is actually leading to the difficulties that the NHS is experiencing. Just I know we've sort of gone through that before, and apologies to people who may have heard Bob speak about this, but I do think given this is still such a current issue, it is well worth just sort of rehearsing some of those points that you previously made, Bob, and any other new ones that you might want to make in relation to the background really to this strike in terms of what they're doing to the National Health Service, which has kind of got us to the situation that we're in at the moment.
Well, there was another article in the Telegraph this week which highlighted the fact that surgeons are spending their time not operating purely because of the endemic dysfunction within the NHS, be that due to lack of theatre space, be that due to dilapidation of surgical facilities, or down to lack of suitably qualified staff. These are all ongoing, entrenched problems that exist within the NHS, and to imply that the junior doctors strike, or the way the junior doctors are interacting with government are chiefly responsible, is totally to miss the impact of the privatization, which is deliberately reduced capacity, caused wage stagnation and deep dissatisfaction amongst the workforce, and a brain drain out of the NHS, which compounds the problems that the government have created, alongside the misdirection of funding to service private finance initiative debt and to run the market within the NHS, which is outsourcing more and more services.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a minute, Bob, if I may. But I just want to stick with some of the other comments that Keir Starmer made to get your reaction to them. He's also on record as saying, "I am a Labour Prime Minister who believes in workers' right to strike." Would you believe? But then he goes on to say, "But let's be clear, when it comes to the strikes planned by resident doctors next week, they should not happen. They are reckless." And again, it's just kind of, putting the blame on the doctors, putting the ball squarely in their court, rather than taking responsibility for the situation that they're responsible for in terms of the background to why the doctors have ended up going on strike. And obviously, part of that is what you've just been talking about there. But how do you respond to that remark from the Prime Minister? He says he's in favour of the workers' right to strike, except when it comes to them taking strike action, it seems.
Well, it seems to me he's competing with Donald Trump in terms of how many contradictions he can get out in a public statement. These are completely conflicting ideas that he's trying to put across, that he's a workers' prime minister, yet he disregards the workers. He hasn't listened to the workers. The tactics Wes Streeting's employing by non-engagement and then giving ultimatums and deadlines for negotiation, this does not strike me as a government at all interested in improving workers' terms and conditions or the respect with which they are treated.
They don't strike me, Bob, I've got to say, as a particularly Labour-oriented government. And I know whenever there's been a Labour government in the past, that there have been disagreements with the trade union movement on various issues from time to time. But by and large, broadly speaking, even under Blair's era, I mean, and that was pushing it a bit, but even under his era, I think, with things like the minimum wage being brought in and so on, kind of were broadly on the same. We were struggling a little bit with Blair, let's be honest, but we were broadly on the same page. But now it seems that they are totally at odds with the trade union movement. So what I know the BMA, British Medical Association, isn't affiliated to the Labour Party, but there are a lot of unions are still affiliated to the party. I know the Bakers Union disaffiliated some time ago. The train drivers union did look at possibly disaffiliating, but they apparently voted not to do so. And I think similarly with the fire brigade union, who got thrown out a while ago. And I remember when I was the shadow minister trying to persuade the fire brigade union to reaffiliate, and couldn't persuade them until Jeremy Corbyn came along as the leader, and then Matt Rack, who was the General Secretary at the time, he led the charge to get the union to re-affiliate at that point in time. But when I approached the FBU about disaffiliating, now the Labour Party has gone in such a kind of negative trajectory in relation to the trade unions. They were sort of resistant. This is a far greater union as well. Were still resistant to disaffiliating when the party's much more kind of anti-trade union, much more right wing than ever it was under Ed Miliband, when they were, we couldn't sort of persuade them to affiliate to the Labour Party at that time. So I just wonder what your, I know it's not strictly speaking to do with the NHS, but what's your thoughts about trade unions who continue to subscribe to the Labour Party, to give them, basically bankroll them and remain affiliated to them?
Yeah, it's a pretty hard position to defend. The trade unions, unfortunately, I think, have undergone the same transformation as the Labour Party. They've drifted to the right. They've accepted neoliberal ideology. Unfortunately, most of the leaders are pretty weak. We know that Sharon Graham, the leader of the Unite Union, Unite refused to even allow screenings of documentaries.
I've lost you, Bob.
Hold on, let me just. Hopefully, you still got my audio.
Yeah, I've got your audio, mate.
Yeah. So Sharon Graham, refused to allow Unite buildings to be used to screen documentaries favourable to the struggles that Jeremy Corbyn had. So their actions haven't really resembled anything like the unions I remember growing up back in the 70s. So they have sort of weakened their stance in terms of protecting workers' rights, as have the Labour Party. They're in service to big capital. We know that Starmer and Rachel Reeves and others have had meetings with the head of BlackRock, Larry Fink, so that they are servicing the billionaire class, the capital class, and just paying lip service to looking after workers.
Yeah, I mean, and we know, you might want to say something about this as well, Bob, that some of the leading figures in the Labour government are very close to the private healthcare industry, and I believe have received contributions from them, haven't they?
Absolutely. So Wes Streeting is a significant figure who's received funding from those who have interests in private healthcare, as has Starmer. I mentioned earlier Larry Fink and BlackRock. They are known to have interests in, they've invested everywhere, to be honest. Most parts of the economy are subject to investments by BlackRock, and healthcare is no exception. So, if you're receiving money from the private health industry, they want a return on their investment, and the return on investment is to carry on with the privatization.
Yeah, and I remember many moons ago, Harold Macmillan, former Tory grandee, former Tory prime minister in the late 1950s, may have been into the early 1960s as well, railing against Margaret Thatcher, selling, as he put it, selling off the family silver. Well, I mean, that's continued, or it did continue under Blair and Brown, and it's being accelerated, being turbocharged in it now with this shower of so-called Labour politicians that are in governments at the moment.
Yeah, so the general trend is to mold every element of the economy, whether it be totally private or publicly funded, to shift it and mold it into something that can provide a profit stream for some private corporation or the other. And healthcare has been turned into a corporate cash cow. And every reform or idea that they put forward, you just have to ask yourself a simple question: who's going to be extracting a profit out of this? Because the whole idea of public service was to remove the profit idea from the service provision, remove any chance of perverse incentives, and provide it in the most efficient way possible, particularly when it's a natural monopoly like rail, water, the
Yeah.
utilities, and healthcare is a natural monopoly.
Mhm.
We've discussed in earlier episodes that you don't go around shopping for health provision. If you're involved in an
No.
accident, you're not going to do a Google search on the best A&E department. You want to go
Yeah.
to the nearest A&E department, having full confidence that it is staffed by competent doctors and nurses who know what they're
Yes.
doing, who aren't overtired, who aren't working in overstretched departments, and have confidence that you're in safe pair of hands. Well, that is what is being removed. The private sector
Mhm.
is not interested in emergency care. The private sector isn't interested in unprofitable care, and that's why the public sector and the NHS was formed in the first place. Before
Yeah, of
before
course.
1948, you had a total mixture of provision. If you were rich, you didn't have much difficulty. If you were dirt poor, you had no access. And if you were lucky, you might end up in a charitable hospital. But so
Mm.
many people went without treatment and suffered the burden of disease. And, life was getting so terrible. Many of them ended up terminating their own lives because of the fear of
Yeah.
suffering and also being a burden to their family, which the NHS removed.
Yes, absolutely, of course. And Bob, you don't have to be a dyed-in-the-wool socialist either, I think, to acknowledge the sorts of services that you just listed there. Healthcare, obviously, being at the top of the list, but healthcare, water, sewage, rail, um, energy, etc., is far better being provided by the public sector, which is devoted or should be devoted entirely to delivering public service, rather than the private sector, whose overriding priority is making money. I was interested. I was listening to an interesting podcast yesterday, I think it was, with Steve Keen, the economist Steve Keen, heterodox economist, really good guy. Spoke actually at the Workers' Party National Members Council earlier in the year. I think it was September. Um, he was speaking to Peter McCormack, who's a kind of really dedicated, comes from the Austrian school of economics. Very much in favour of a small government, minimal government, minimal, as he puts it, interference from the state, as it were. But it's a long, well worth watching, by the way. Anybody, if you get the chance over the Christmas holidays, 2.5 hours, but it's really quite fascinating. But even he had to acknowledge that key services like sewage and so on are far better provided in the public sector. I mean, I think he just had to accept the force of Steve's arguments about that. So it's really curious, isn't it, that a so-called Labour government, that was established 120 odd years ago now, with a view to prioritizing the interests of the working class, is now very much in the private sector court, very much in the corporation court in that sense, and are doing everything they can, it seems, to facilitate the selling off. I mean, the last vestiges of the family silver that Harold Macmillan was talking about. This lot that's in power at the minute seems to be determined to sell everything off. I mean, they're cozying up to BlackRock, talking about these vulture capitalists. Well, they don't refer to them as vulture capitalists, but they as being the savior. This is the way we're going to grow the economy. This is the way we're going to re-inject prosperity into the economy again. But of course, as we know, most of that prosperity is going to go to working class people. It's going to go in the pockets of the multimillionaires, the billionaires, and the corporate fat cats, isn't it?
Absolutely. We just have to look at the two examples that jump out to me are electricity and water, right? So when Thatcher went about privatizing these utilities, we were promised the private sector is so wonderful, so innovative, so efficient that everybody's bills would come down and we'd have a fantastic service. Well, we have the most expensive electricity, I believe, in the world. And we have a privatized water system that is able to extract billions in profit, very well paid CEOs and senior managers, but they're pumping raw sewage into our rivers and seas. So that is not what we were sold. There has not been one new
No.
reservoir built in the country since privatization. Now, that
Mm.
should clearly demonstrate that private companies are not interested in innovation. They're not interested in investment. And ultimately, I believe they are sitting pretty confident that the state will have to step in when they fail. Because
Mm.
what else will happen if we can't do without water? It's an essential part of life.
Yeah.
And when these private companies go bust, when they've borrowed themselves to the hilt to actually pay out pay out bonuses and dividends, a lot of that is coming out based on debt. There'll come a point where they'll just say service is going to collapse. Why don't you step in, guys? And they'll walk away
Yeah.
without any penalty, as did the
No.
banks back in 2008. The public had to bail them
Yeah.
out. They're up to their old tricks again. They're reckless lending. We've got this expanding shadow
Yeah.
banking industry, which is totally unregulated. So when they're when money's to be made, that is lost to the public. But when there's a
Yeah.
service to be rescued, well, guess who comes in? It's the public purse.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and some of those things that you just went through, Bob, and actually, when you've responded to this, I just want to just check with Alan if there's anybody wants to make a comment or ask you a question before we move on. But I mean, obviously, pumping raw sewage has a significant, unobvious health implication, but so does the high energy bills, doesn't it? The fuel poverty, and I guess you may see, patients, I guess, struggling with the consequences of living in cold homes. These are really quite fundamental life and death issues, aren't they? Really, not just ill health issues. They can potentially be life and death. Very, very high energy bills, and people getting ill through pollution in the water stream and so on.
Absolutely. So we know that every winter, because of the cold weather, there's a significant increase in the deaths of elderly people. Now, if they can't afford to heat their house, they're sitting around very cold. That will have a knock-on effect on their immune system, and that's unfortunately how they succumb to the winter viruses. So, being so poor that you can't adequately eat or feed yourselves has a
Yeah.
has a demonstrable effect on life expectancy. So we know that. And the government are quite happy to price people into an early grave. So whatever they say about their wishes to improve healthcare, it just does not fit with the rest of their policies. And
Mhm.
remember,
Mhm.
Starmer promised to renationalize water, to renationalize the utilities before he got into
Yeah.
office. So his rhetoric is that of old Labour, but as soon as they
Yeah.
got into power, his actions are of Thatcher on steroids.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it is a travesty. And we know, I mean, and it's not hyperbole from your point of view. And I know you don't indulge in hyperbole anyway, Bob, but just for anybody who may think that you may have been exaggerating slightly there in relation to the impact on elderly people, the Labour Party, before they got into power, I think it was under Jeremy Corbyn's watch, and it was when the Conservatives were talking about scrapping the winter fuel payment, they did an impact assessment and calculated that it would potentially lead to just under 4,000 elderly people losing their lives. So we're talking literally about a matter of life and death. And yet, when Labour came into office, one of the first things they did was to scrap the winter fuel payment. They've partially reinstated it now, but I suspect now, that there are quite a lot of people who've lost their parents and grandparents as a direct consequence of that decision. I mean, these people should be held accountable for this. I mean, it's kind of almost like sort of state sort of manslaughter, really, in my opinion. But
Well, there's
yeah,
been a lot of
oh, sorry, Bob.
research into the impact of the post 2008 financial crash and the
Yeah,
austerity agenda that we were subjected to for over a decade. And there's various
yeah,
figures of upwards of 300,000, 500,000 premature deaths as a result of the austerity program. So, you don't have to take our word for it. The evidence is out there from,
yeah,
authoritative organizations like the World World Health Organization and the UN and various other organizations who can do a detailed assessment of the impact of austerity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just want to ask Alan now in the gallery if we've got anybody who wants to make a comment or ask Bob any questions
yes,
at this
we've
stage.
got John Homer waiting to speak, so go ahead, John.
Okay, mate.
Hello.
Oh, good, mate. Hi. What do you want to say to Bob?
Yeah, sorry, the sound was breaking up there. I'm not sure if that was for everyone else as well. Beg your pardon. I hope that doesn't happen again. Can you hear me okay?
No.
Yeah?
Yeah, we're fine, mate. Got you loud and clear.
Yeah, excellent. Obviously, those that know me know that I've worked in mental health for a long time, and I do appreciate that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the health service, sometimes mental health gets overlooked a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think there's been this kind of progression over time that we've seen, those of us working in mental health, where the reliance upon what they call the third sector, so the charity sector, has just increased massively. And I think, I mean, I'm not sure the exact figures, but the beds now that are available within the NHS are a really quite a small percentage of what they were. And I think how it used to be, going right back at the start of the health service, was that mental health beds weren't just for people who had mental health problems, as odd as that sounds. I mean, anybody who had autism or learning difficulties, anybody who was homeless and disowned by the family. There was some very kind of inappropriate uses of those beds back in the old days. But what we've got now is a situation where it's actually really, really difficult to occupy a mental health bed, and we're relying upon services, and they're very good services. Chris and Bob, I mean, some of them are invaluable to people who was struggling with domestic violence, drug and alcohol problems, people victims of sexual abuse, and so forth. And just homeless people who may have drug, alcohol problems, mental health problems, whatever. So what we're seeing within mental health is a kind of a collapse of the social security net that was there that captured these people. And I just want to link that to things like homelessness, and also, our capability to be able to support people who have autism, mental health difficulties, drug and alcohol problems. What we're seeing is really a collapse of that system, and we're totally relying, really, as I say, on charity to be able to do that. And the funding from government again comes out the public purse, but there's a lack of accountability within that, because it doesn't fall within the usual sort of governance that we have. There are, of course, efforts to have some kind of governance, but to me, what this represents is essentially our society breaking down and being unable to sort of support any of us that happen to fall from grace, fall from family life, fall from employment. It can happen to any of us, and I think I just want to bring that in, because I think
absolutely, John. Yeah, actually, I've got a question to you, John, as well.
Sure.
I mean, I know you're speaking about mental health, but I just wondered if you got any thoughts about care in the community. I mean, back in the day, I mean, I'm going back about 40 odd years now. I worked at at a hospital. It was sort of occupational therapy type role that I had. I wasn't a qualified occupational therapist, but I was working with people with learning disabilities essentially.
Yeah.
And there was a move before your time, probably, because you're a lot younger than me, I think. But
I don't know, Chris.
there was a move. There was a move anyway. There's a move for so-called care in the community, which sounded, great in principle. But some of the patients that I worked with, and I still see them now around Derby, but just kind of wandering around kind of fairly aimlessly, they look like lost souls, really. And I'm not saying that the hospital setting was perfect.
Yeah.
Far from it. But it was a sort of sheltered environment. as best I could tell, it seemed people were happy-ish, you know. I've certainly got on well with with the patients I work with, and they seem to have a purpose in their life. And I'm just looking at, and it just looked very sad, in that sense. And I mean, look, if we were going to do care in the community properly, it would have been a damn sight more expensive than maintaining these hospitals. But I think it was seen as doing it on the cheap. But I don't know if you've got any experience of care in the community, what your thoughts are about care in the community, and what needs to be done. And then we'll bring Bob in to improve care in the community.
So it's a really good question, and it's part of what I'm saying, because care in the community was a kind of a buzz catchphrase that was difficult to argue with when people first spoke about it, because everybody agreed that the old institutions were not, they needed modernizing, and they weren't what they should have been. And there was a similar thing that happened in Italy several years before it started to happen in this country, which I think really started in the 80s, but especially the 90s, where they just pretty much closed down well, I suppose at the time they were called psychiatric units. And it was a complete disaster. It was, what they were doing was they were saying, well, we're just institutionalizing these people. Let's just kind of put them back into the community and they won't be institutionalized, and somehow that will be a good thing. And it was a complete failure. But I think in this country, the care in the community was the buzzword. They were basically saying, this is a good thing, this is a movement in the direction. But as you suggest, it just wasn't done properly. And over time, the reliance was on the third sector, was on the charity sectors to be able to do that.
Yeah. And indeed, not the statutory sector.
Yeah. So basically, it was a nice excuse, but really they use it as an excuse to kind of just not do things properly and not support people. And there was I noticed, because I've left the health service now, but I noticed in the latter years that there was a trend towards forming partnerships between NHS trusts and charities such as Mind and so forth, where they would set up initiatives because perhaps there was a concern. It had been expressed perhaps in the House of Parliament that, there weren't enough services for sexual abuse victims, or any other thing that happened to be topical at the time. And initiatives would have been set up. They were advertised within, the community and within, perhaps GP surgeries and hospitals and so forth, to say to people, look, here's a service that's available. And that, again, that seemed like a really good thing, and it was difficult to argue with. But the problem was they set up a lot of services, but they didn't maintain them. So a lot of things just collapsed. And this is what we've seen a lot more of. And I'm wanting to link, especially homelessness, but actually quite a lot of other issues as well. I mean, myself now, I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist. So I work with people who have basically been through a lot of stuff. And, the most obvious one is if people have been through childhood trauma, they're obviously going to have a lot of difficulties. But there are now, evidence-based treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy that are very effective if they're delivered, to people in the right way. But the problem is that they're not. They're not being delivered. And and the investment would be in doing something properly at the right time for someone, and essentially just getting them back to where they should be. And you're not always going to succeed in that. I appreciate that, but I think a lot of people have been abandoned, and I think there's a lot of bitterness about this. And I think people there are a lot of people out there who feel like they've been completely abandoned, and the go-to is drugs and alcohol, crime, and worst of all, of course, suicide. Suicide,
and then we get the sort of the knee-jerk response from certain politicians about we need a more punitive authoritarian response to a symptom of a problem rather than actually dealing with the root cause of it. But let me bring Bob in. I mean, I just wonder what your thoughts are on what John's been saying there. I mean, what he was setting out, Bob, but in some ways it sounded a bit like we were going back to the sort in terms of mental health and people with learning disabilities anyway. to the situation that you were describing before the National Health Service was set up, where you were very much reliant on the charitable sector to a large extent. And problem is, when you bring in the charitable sector, unless they're properly funded, they're going to fall over, as John is saying there. And of course, and if they're outside of the statutory sector, it's almost like a Pontius Pilate washing their hands of it. Well, it's not to do with us, Gov. It's a sort of separate entity. The charities failed, but as a result of lack of funding from the centre. But what's your thoughts on that, Bob? And just more generally in regard to the other points that John made?
Yeah, so the mental health services were the first part of the NHS to really feel this sort of drift of abandonment, which John points out. Now, let's not forget, all these mental health institutions sometimes were in fantastic buildings on lots of ground. This was a huge real estate opportunity for the private property developers. So that was the real motivation for a lot of the sell-off that took place then. And they thought, well, let's try with mental health, because maybe there's less public sympathy for mental health. There's a bit of a stigma around it. And in order to make the case, well, these are really poor services and people are institutionalized, well, you make sure you don't modernize the service, right?
Yeah.
So you make it look like a basket case, then you enlist the charitable sector for a bit of a crossover period where everything looks reasonable, and then you pull the plug. There no longer is any public provision, so your safety net is gone. And our mental health patients, a lot of them are being housed in prisons because they've fallen foul of the law. A lot of them are sleeping on the streets and having their life expectancy cut by 5 or 10 years. And others are languishing in a very underfunded, what remains of NHS provision. A lot of this, as John pointed out, is dressed up as partnership. Let's not forget, the charity sector has also morphed into something very akin to a corporation, where you have a lot of money spent on advertising and chief executive bonuses. I'd love to know what proportion of people's generous donations actually get to delivering care. And also they're out of the public eye, they're out of regulation, and the provision is not statutory anymore. So we've gone backwards in many ways. We've gone back to the pre NHS era, where it's luck of the draw. And it's nobody's responsibility.
It's an absolute scandal, Bob. It really is. And I know you've been doing your best to wake people up. The fear is if we get a reform government in power, I mean, they'll be put even further turbochargers on the privatisation agenda that the so-called Labour government is engaged in.
But let's not lose sight on who's actually steering this ship. It's the big four accountancy firms, it's the management consultants, it's the City of London, it's BlackRock, and it's the insurers. Unfortunately, whatever shade of politician, they're not coming up with any genius ideas themselves. What comes out of their mouth is often scripted. They have these spads who've gone through the revolving door and then suddenly, become advisors. So that element of it is pretty sewn up. You're right, reform would be an absolute disaster, but no more disastrous than Starmer's Labour Party.
Yeah, it's just a continuation. Yeah, I know, but a lot of people, a lot of people are looking to them.
I just want to give you a couple of examples of what happens in the States. So, more than half of our mental health beds are privately provided now. Some of the companies already have a bad track record in the States. I'll give you an example of a case where a private company, because it had vacant beds, and vacant beds don't make money, they were going and kidnapping former patients who were well and locking them in on beds to get maximum occupancy so they could maximize their money, right? And other nursing homes, for example, privately run nursing homes in the States, were coding people terminally ill because they attracted a higher rate of reimbursement from the state. Some of their
Right.
terminally ill patients were traveling around America on Amtrak. So you can
Wow.
see at every opportunity, no
Yeah.
matter how unethical, even downright fraudulent, whatever
Yeah.
increases the bottom line will be done.
Wow. Yeah. Incredible. Incredible. I mean, just going back to the point about homelessness as well. I mean, nobody should be living on the street. Nobody should be homeless in this country. It's the sixth biggest economy in the world, very wealthy country. With political will, we could not just eliminate homelessness, we could eliminate poverty, but it's going to take political will to make it happen. And that political will does not exist with any of the political parties sitting in Westminster at the moment, and certainly not with Reform, where a lot of people are thinking they might be the Seventh Cavalry riding over the hill as a sort of a great sort of anti-establishment outfit. They're not. They are the pillars of the establishment, and it's really important, I think, that we wake people up to the fact that they are not any sort of alternative to what we've had for certainly the last year and a half under the Labour government, and indeed the last sort of 40 or 50 years of neoliberal, the neoliberal economic agenda that all the parties have been pursuing really since Margaret Thatcher. Actually, a little bit before that, even really under Jim Callaghan and Dennis Healey in 1976. But before we move on, then, Alan, just in the gallery, anybody else want to make a point? Is Alan
Yeah,
with us?
there's nobody at the moment, Chris.
Okay, mate. No, cool, mate. Well, let me just move on then, if I can, then, Bob, because one of the other things I saw just this week, reported by, I think it was the BBC, if I'm not mistaken, actually, that operations and treatments are being cut back as NHS orders hospitals to save money. This is building really on, I think, the point you were making about dilapidated hospitals, but according to the BBC, anyway, that managers of the NHS are deliberately cutting back. I mean, what do you make of that report? I don't know if you saw it, Bob. I think it was it did come out. When are we today? Come out on Friday. BBC reported that on Friday, but I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So the first thing to say is it's utterly disgraceful and a betrayal of those patients who have been languishing on waiting lists to experience yet more unnecessary delays economically, in terms of addressing the NHS spending as some sort of economic drain. Well, the opposite is true. We know that if you help people restore them back to work, they're going to contribute to society, contribute to the economy. You will free up their relatives who may be working as carers or contributing to their care at the moment. So you're liberating economic activity. So it doesn't make actually any rational sense on economic terms. And we also know health spending delivers something called an economic multiplier effect. That means for every pound invested in healthcare returns up to multiples of that time, 5 to 10 times what you've spent. So it's actually an economic stimulus to spend on healthcare. So this is
Right.
an insanely stupid idea, but feeds into that sort of narrative about the household budget, and doubling down on economic illiteracy, which you talk very well on often on our previous discussions.
Yeah, no, indeed. I just want to read a passage from this article, if I might, Bob, because it picks up on an issue that you've previously raised in earlier episodes. It says regional health boards have ordered some hospitals to cut back on the number of patients they are seeing, meaning hundreds of thousands of patients could have to wait longer for treatment. The rationing measures are being applied mainly to private firms doing NHS work, but multiple NHS hospitals are understood to be affected too. NHS managers said they were between a rock and a hard place, trying to juggle balancing the books with tackling the hospital backlog, which currently stands at 7.4 million. Reducing waits for things like hip and knee operations and hitting the 18-week waiting time target is the government's number one priority for the health service. But the documents seen by the BBC show integrated care boards, which are in charge of spending on behalf of NHS England, asking hospitals to make patients wait longer and reduce the number they treat until the end of the financial year. One asked a private provider to reduce activity by nearly 30% and to make patients wait 8 weeks longer on average, while stopping taking on new referrals for a period as a way to cut back on the amount being done. Now, I know you've railed against and warned about these integrated care boards, and I know you know in previous episodes you've spoken about the the likely consequences of these integrated care boards being established, and here we have it now, even being reported by the BBC, which isn't exactly that critical of the government, is it? I mean, many people see the BBC as a sort of stenographers, really, for the establishment. But I mean, that's sort of really bringing your worst nightmares. I mean, it's kind of here it is, they're in black and white and being reported on by the BBC. Bob, I mean, this is what you were predicting, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to note how many different organisations are pointing the finger at each other. There seems to be an utter fragmentation of accountability. So the government is saying we can't afford it. The ICB is saying, well, the government are telling us to do it, and that has a knock-on effect on the provision. So it should be clear that the Secretary of State for Health really, hands up, it's nothing to do with me, Gov. He is showing how removed he is from the front line in terms of accountability. I'm not sure what really lies behind this. Is it trying to get us used to the idea that the ICB will control what it chooses to spend money on? Because ultimately that is the direction of travel. This new public-private entity, the Integrated Care Board, will ultimately decide what services it provides and to who. For example, they may decide for a population of 2 to 3 million that they will no longer provide fertility services to the whole population. So is this story a way of normalizing the concept that these organizations can just stop providing care? And I think maybe there is an element of that in this story.
Right.
I can't really understand why this government, which is in bed with the private sector, would reduce the funding flows to the private sector unless there is a genuine problem of workforce capacity. So if you don't even have enough surgeons who often moonlight from the NHS to the private sector, is this a plausible narrative to deflect from the real problem, which could be a workforce problem?
Yeah, no, indeed. Yeah, interesting. Let me just, before we move on again then, Bob, to something else which has been in the headlines this week, to just ask Alan in the gallery there if anybody else
No, Chris, carry on, my friend.
Okay, mate. Yeah, cool. Well, the other thing which has been in the headlines this week, in fact, yesterday, I saw something about a risk to women of severe bleeding after giving birth at a 5-year high in England. Apparently, rates have risen by about 19%, I think it was, according to an article in the Guardian. 19% increase, that is, based on the figures as they stood in 2020, which is prompting fresh concerns really about NHS maternity care. Now, my stepdaughter is actually pregnant at the moment, due to give birth in March of next year. So this is a particular concern to me personally, but I'm sure it will be of interest, of course, to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people all over the country. What's your thoughts about this, Bob? Is this just another symptom of where things are going wrong with the way in which the organisation, the NHS, is sort of organised, or what? What's happening, do you think?
Yeah, so there's several factors at play. You have maternity units across the country that are struggling. There have been various maternity scandals in terms of preventable baby deaths or maternal deaths. Units such as in Nottingham. We've also had the maternity hospital in Margate was under scrutiny. So there have been various newsworthy disasters within maternity services. So there is an inquiry going on into maternity services. But as we've discussed before, these inquiries are often set up not to find the actual systemic problem. We saw this with mid-staffs. Now, the reason they're suggesting that these postpartum bleeds are going up Some of them are related to the maternal factors. So unfortunately, mothers are more unhealthy and they're having babies at a later age. Obesity,
Right.
maternal age are factors in the mix. But
Yes.
on top of that, you have a lack of staff, patients getting to maternity units late, often told to stay at home a bit too long. Maybe their
Yes.
actual pregnancy and delivery not being supervised enough, frequently enough, or by suitably qualified staff in very busy units where there may be a delay in access to surgical intervention. So all of these adding together, showing this the 5-year rise in terms of maternal bleeding. It's a marker of not only issues with maternal health, but also systemic failings within the maternity service, which is as a result of much of what we've discussed. And I think,
Mm.
if you wanted to get to the truth, I don't think you need a multi-million-pound public inquiry. You just need to get in contact with 100 or so midwives who've recently left the service, maybe
Yeah.
prematurely, and said, "Why did you leave?" And I think the answers would
Yeah.
come thick and fast. There
Sure.
weren't enough
Yeah.
of us. There weren't enough doctors to come and operate when we required them. There aren't enough
Yeah.
beds on the maternity unit, and we're looking after too many patients per midwife.
Yeah. No,
It's
indeed. It's kind of
blatantly
pretty
obvious
tricky.
what the problem is.
No, indeed, indeed, indeed. And it's kind of like exacerbating the problem, I suppose, isn't it? Because, people feeling that, the system's so overstretched that, they're so stressed in terms of trying to deliver a good service, and the people just, bail out in the end because they can't cope with it. And then that puts even more pressure on the service. But I just want to pick up on one of the points that you made, Bob, and just link it back, really, because, sometimes people might wonder, well, why are you talking about the economy so much, when we're talking about health? But you made a really important point in your contribution just there, where you talked about, women, for example, having babies later now on average, health problems, not as healthy maybe as they once were, and things like obesity, etc., etc. Well, these are directly linked, aren't they, to 40 or 50 years of neoliberalism. The reason why people very often are delaying their starting a family is because of the cost of housing, which has gone, if I might use the pun, through the roof. And so it's very difficult now for people to get established and be able to have the environment in which they feel confident about starting a family. Precarious employment now is endemic throughout the land, and of course, and that will have a consequence as well, just in terms of people's feeling secure enough to actually start a family, but also people are short of money, just the ability to have a healthy diet, and this is having this knock-on effect, as well as all the other problems which you just made relating directly to the National Health Service itself. But that underlying problem, people delaying starting a family, the health problems that you mentioned, etc., all link back, don't they, to the economic agenda, which has created this monster, really, where the economy isn't working for ordinary people in this country. It's serving the interests of the elites. It's serving the interests of the faceless corporations. It's not serving the interests of ordinary people in this country. And we know, don't we, from the figures, the UN figures, United Nations rapporteur showed that there was over 14.5 million people living in poverty in this country a few years ago. And that figure's only got worse of late. That is a problem, isn't it? This kind of, no matter what we did with the National Health Service, even if we, made the kind of Rolls Royce, we reorganized it in a way in which you have advocated, Bob, and made sure it was properly funded and so on. That wouldn't solve the root cause of some of these problems, would it? Because whilst people might get better care, more effective care, the supply stream, I suppose, if I put it that way, of patients coming through with these complex problems, etc. And people as in regards to maternity care, delaying starting a family and all the rest of it, all those problems are still going to be there, aren't they, if we don't sort out the economy?
Absolutely. So the biggest factor driving chronic disease and poor maternal health, stress is cannot be understated, whether it be through lack of income, lack of job security. All of these things increase your chronic stress, and chronic stress drives insulin production. When you're chronically stressed, you're going to go for comfort foods, fast foods, ultra processed foods, gives you a bit of a high, they're addictive. So you end up adopting unhealthy behaviors, and people say, well, you're making bad choices, but these are heavily advertised. These foods are designed to be addictive. And
Yes,
and
indeed.
before you know it, you're putting on weight, you're destroying your body's metabolism, you're not getting, healthy natural food packed with vitamins and antioxidants, so the weight creeps up. You increase your risk in getting diabetes in pregnancy, high blood pressure in pregnancy, and just because you're getting bigger, also that an insulin resistant, that has a knock-on effect on the size of the baby, because diabetic mothers will produce very big babies who are more prone to multiple complications during delivery. And you're right, if we're living in a chronically stressed society, who can't afford to eat well and are brainwashed to advertise ultra processed junk, then the demands on the healthcare cannot keep up if you're not tackling the root cause, which is stress, wealth inequality, and marketing by big food companies driven by profit, driving us all to live unhealthy, chronically disease-ridden lives.
Yeah, I mean, and the right wing of the political spectrum talk about the nanny state. Margaret Thatcher talked about the nanny state, and going back to Reform UK, I mean, they're Thatcherite 2.0. I mean, they're absolutely turbo. Again, they'll keep using the term turbocharged. They are turbocharged Thatcherites, and they very much would be against, as they see it, over regulation. But this is where you talked about, and I'm pleased you mentioned that, Bob, about foods, some of these fast foods being addictive. We know that the food industry very cynically have done this. They've experimented with different combinations of some of these processed foods to make them addictive. I mean, these people, again, they are causing this health crisis. And we've got political parties sitting in Parliament. I don't know how many of them are funded by the big food industry companies. I'm sure some of them are. We know certainly they're getting funding from the private healthcare and the pharmaceutical sector. But we need to clamp down on these things, don't we? I mean, this is where you need regulation to stop this sort of abuse, frankly, of the population.
Absolutely. So the history of big food is quite interesting, because back in the late 50s, early 60s, the tobacco companies knew the game was up. They could no longer lie convincingly that tobacco didn't cause lung cancer. So the same companies bought up food companies, and their scientists went from designing flavorings for tobacco into designing food, and they designed food to be addictive. It's not based on nutrition. When you process food, you actually remove the nutrition, you remove the fiber, you remove any goodness, and they've discovered certain combinations of loading it up with sugar and a certain amount of vegetable fats hit that sweet spot literally in your brain, which says, soon as you finish, I want some more of that. So they have created a population of ultra processed food addicted people, and they say, well, it's your own choice. No, it isn't, because you've made us addicted by designing food for exactly that outcome.
It's a perfect example, really, Bob, of why just putting everything into the hands of the market, as it were, as if the market will find the solutions for a good society. Just simply, just doesn't work, because, as I said previously, their main focus is making money. And I'm old enough to remember, Bob, talking about smoking, that when it first started, some of the reports coming out about the health consequences of smoking, they would get advertisements where saying doctors smoke, I can't remember which brand of cigarette it was, but the doctors smoke a certain brand of cigarette to kind of give it that kind of reassuring endorsement. Oh, if doctors are smoking, it must be okay. I think people are utterly bloody cynical, and we've really got to bring them to heel. Very briefly, Bob, we're nearly out of time. I'm just going to ask Alan quickly if there's anybody got a question they want to or a comment they want to make.
No, Chris, we haven't got
Alan in the
anyone,
gallery?
unfortunately.
No.
Yeah,
Very finally, then, Bob. I just wondered what your thoughts are, perhaps in just in a minute or so, about the government apparently going to prioritise UK medical graduates for training places. I think this is part of the dispute, isn't it, with the doctors at the moment, that just in terms of providing one of the concerns they have about training places for doctors. Well, what's your thoughts on their statement, on their announcement on that, saying the government's going to prioritise UK medical graduates for training places from 2026 as part of an effort to bring an end to industrial action by the resident doctors?
Yeah, well, that was just one of the issues that the resident doctors wanted to be addressed. It sounds good, but we need to know the detail regarding what does prioritise mean.
Yes.
What does it mean at the end of the training period? For example, I'm a GP trainer. We have doctors who've already done 2 years of foundation training, then they enter a GP training program, which is another 3 years, and I see them in the final year. Well, what happens after that? Because we still have a problem of the introduction of GP substitutes in primary care called physicians associates, and those roles are 70% funded outside of the GP's normal income stream. So doctors are voting with their pocket. Unfortunately, the GPs are the incumbent GPs are choosing to employ these non-doctors who are subsidized, whereby these GPs finishing training have no jobs to go to. So it doesn't address that issue.
No, indeed. There's lots more to talk about there.
Yeah.
Perhaps let's come back maybe to this. I'm sure we probably will in the next episode, Bob, but we're out of time now. Really been going for just over an hour, so I think we should probably curtail it at that point. Thanks again, Bob, for your insightful contributions. I really appreciate that. And thanks to John as well, who was our solitary contributor from the floor this evening. And that was an interesting discussion, I think, as well. And
Chris,
we'll be back, hopefully, all being well.
Can you hear me?
Oh, hang on. What's this, Alan?
Sorry, we've
I can hear you, Alan.
got a comment from Mary Whitby, and she said,
Oh,
can you ask Bob if vapes are the next addictive, dangerous products to replace cigarettes and junk food? The same profiteers just find the next product until people get wise to it. And why would health professionals encourage patients to use vapes?
You want me to carry on, Chris?
Briefly, Bob. Let's maybe we'll come back to this next week, but just give us a brief response back to that, Bob.
A brief response. I think they have a place if you're definitely going to want to stop smoking. If you're using it as part of a smoking quitting plan, then fair enough. But unfortunately, most vape smokers are the youngsters. They feel it's quite cool and trendy to smoke, to use a vape. But there are problems associated with inhaling hot oils, which a lot of these vapes contain, because they can actually damage the lung as well. So short-term use as part of smoking cessation, fine. But long-term use, you're looking at other problems 10, 20 years down the line.
Right, okay. Maybe we'll have a longer conversation, Bob, next time about that, because I think that is an issue which is not going away anytime soon, is it? But again, thanks, Bob, for your contributions, as I was saying, tonight. Thanks, everybody, for watching and listening. And as I say, we'll be back next week. So until then, take care, and we'll see you soon.